Stafford, thanks for coming in. We had a very interesting conversation last week where we talked about this so-called digital clash of civilizations, which you think is coming. You're predicting a real battle between mobile operators and banks over the next few years. Can you just talk a bit about why you say that and what your expectations are?
I think when you talk about the digital clash of civilizations, I'm actually completing the book. And one aspect within that umbrella description is what technology is doing to different industries, from a convergence perspective, from strategy perspective, from what they're going to be doing in the next 3 to 5 years. And I've posited out there, and people have taken little snippets of it, but I've said one of the aspects that I see coming is the banking financial world and the telecommunications world absolutely heading towards the same goal. They're going to the same area, the same pot, the same pool. And I see that as transaction enablement, and I see that as where the next big revenue sits for the telcos. You know, telcos have run around, they've done a lot of voice. They're still milking that voice revenue, and it's doing really, really well. They've jumped into data. Data continues to do well, but none of those are really sustainable in the long term. If you look at the next 3 to 5 years, I predict there will be a tremendous decline in that area. But I think where the pickup will be won't be content platforms, won't be application and cloud and all these technology buzzwords. What it will be is transaction enablement. I think the telcos are starting to wake up and realize that their role is actually not to try and compete with the Googles, to compete with the Amazons, to compete with the Apples, because they can't compete, and they're trying really hard to compete in that space. But where they are winning, in the cloud areas, in the value-added resell and integrator space, they're realizing the margins are not as big as that they had in voice. So the question is, where's that next big one? And I believe the pendulum is kind of swing towards the middle, and that middle is transaction enablement, because every phone becomes a credit card.
And that's going to put necessarily going to put the mobile operators on a collision course with the banks. What's the fallout going to be?
I don't, you know, I've toned that down, the whole clash aspect of it, because I've seen iterations where there's more like a co-opetition, or there's partnerships that are evolving, which are quite interesting. But I believe that if you take a look at what's happening with the mobile device, it's not up to the telcos, it's not up to the banks. With these near-field communication chipsets, with these virtual currencies emerging, with these little peripherals that get plugged into mobile devices that allow for credit card swiping, I believe that transaction being cleared, that transaction being serviced, that transaction being enabled within a content service is where the next generation of volume annuity revenue sits for the telecommunications environment.
Now, Vodacom announced its results this week, and we've obviously seen, in terms of mobile payments, we've seen M-Pesa being a huge success in Kenya, and that's now being replicated in Tanzania. But Vodacom admitted at the results presentation this week that M-Pesa hasn't really taken off here in South Africa. Do you think that's just a temporary thing? Do you think that that's because the South African market is better served by banks than some of the other African markets? Where do you think this is going to lead over the next few years? What is this Vodacom M-Pesa announcement telling you about the South African market and mobile payments?
Yeah, we almost have to take a step back. I mean, TNS came out with a research report today that says they've seen such huge emerging market growth around mobile payments and mobile banking. And it's quite interesting that they're suddenly seeing this, and we've kind of predicted this for about the last 3 years. M-Pesa in South Africa, I think M-Pesa was very successful in Kenya because it was bank agnostic. There wasn't a specific bank that it was wrapped around. It was a telco that went to market with it, and it spread very, very virally. I think the way M-Pesa is being structured in South Africa, we've got the NetBank partnership, we've got Vodacom, and they're going to market. And I think it's still as open and cross-platform as it is from a phone perspective. I still think the fact that it's linked to a particular financial institute may be an Achilles heel. I believe that will change in time. And I think that whole model with M-Pesa is an interesting one, because it goes back to my argument and my posits, which is, you know, maybe Vodacom should have brought M-Pesa into the country and had their own banking license, or cleared that themselves, you know, and worked with all the banks.
Well, do you think that the banks, like MTN, Vodacom, Cell C, etc., the mobile operators, are eventually going to go to the Reserve Bank and ask for their own banking license?
I think it's inevitable. I think it's either they'll buy banks, or they'll melt with banks, or we'll see very close partnerships with banks, simply for regulatory compliance and clearance. Okay. As soon as you have a money out situation, the Reserve Bank says, hey, you've got to have someone there following the certain procedures and certain standards. And that we saw with M-Pesa happening. I think the pressure is going to be too big on the telcos to continually go back to banks, because banks are looking at this over the wall, and I think they're quite worried. I think this whole disintermediation play is becoming more and more prevalent. We saw prepaid models coming up, where prepaid funeral insurance, prepaid chickens, you know, with virtual currency on mobile devices are less about it being banked and more about the accessibility of it. And in emerging markets, the need for that is enormous. And I think in South Africa, the need is still enormous. Take a look at our banking population, it's not that big. And I think our rural community is very, very large. So I think it is still applicable here. Now, You know, the banks are looking at this, and the banks have partnerships. You've got Standard Bank doing stuff with MTN. They've got Beyond Payments with Home and Sing heading up that unit. You've got APSA doing their thing. You know, FNB is doing PayPal. They're doing e-bucks. And they've got derivatives of M-Pesa. This is, to me, iterations, but this is not the ultimate scene at the end of the day. I do believe the operators, the telecommunication folks, the folks that have the footprint, that actually have the devices and they're provisioning out those devices. Because, in my opinion, what's going to happen in the next 3 to 5 years, the phone changes from being a device that does voice and data to a credit card that does voice and data. And that changes the game tremendously, because when you're seeing all these transactions being cleared and the volumes are extremely high, and this concept of being able to pay anywhere easily coming to be, that's going to be an interesting thing.
Now, this definitely sounds like a threat to the banks. How should the banks be reacting? What more should they be doing that they're not doing right now?
I've seen knee-jerks. I've been engaged in some meetings and some of the banks in South Africa on a board level, and there's been some knee-jerk reactions. And some of the banks are saying, hey, why don't we move closer to where they are? You know, why don't we get into this licensing game? And you can see, you know, what I'm saying right now, just to make it absolutely clear, this is very South African and SADC orientated, because the regulatory compliance or framework around banking is very loose compared to anywhere else in the world. You know, the way we do banking here, the way mobile banking works here is very far ahead of some of the G8 countries out there, simply because we've got the freedom to do it. And because of that framework, we're going to have these shifts and moves that are very unique to here. It's going to be a very local play, a very geo play. This is not an international opinion that I have. I think it's going to be very, very relevant. We lead in mobile banking. We lead in cell phone banking. If you take a look at the rest of the world, that's not going to change. I mean, where in the world does a bank provide you with connectivity? FNB Connect. Yes. Where in the world does a bank provide you an email address? APSA. Remember, APSA was one of the biggest ISPs in the country. So this is very strange if you look at any one of the more developed countries where banks are banks and banks do what banking is. They don't get into this game. Here we see the murking of the waters. And I think it's inevitable that the banks are going to try and move closer to where the telcos are. I think there's going to be partnerships like we see happening, FNB Connect with Vodacom Business and delivering out a service for connectivity, but it's inevitable that the banks, who knows, a bank providing their own mobile platform, their own cell phone, with their own app store, with their own iTunes clone, selling that as a credit card service out to people.
It's certainly going to be an interesting few years. Stafford, thanks so much for joining me in the studio today.
Thanks so much.
Stafford Masie, thank you.